Last week, there was a bit of a to-do when an MSNBC news producer, actually he is the producer for The Last Word, the senior producer for the program on NBC called The Last Word, a guy by the name of Kyle Griffin, took to Twitter and informed us that, quote, Japan has decided not to send senior officials to the Beijing Olympics in February, a move that will align it with the United States diplomatic boycott over China's alleged human rights abuses. Now, putting aside all the questions about why an MSNBC senior producer is tweeting about anything, you'll be unsurprised to learn that the tweet created something of a firestorm. It seems like nobody can tweet anything anymore without creating a firestorm of some sort. This particular tweet, however, created a firestorm of criticism over the word alleged, particularly referring to China's alleged human rights abuses. Those alleged human rights abuses are pretty well, what's the word for it? English. Documented. Pretty well pointed out, pretty well known to just about everybody, including the Biden administration, who is putting on a diplomatic boycott of the Olympics over these abuses of human rights issues. Now, look, a diplomatic boycott is stupid. It's a waste of time. It will accomplish nothing. It won't do anything. And in fact, most of the U.S. athletes that have been asked about it are ambivalent because they don't care, because it doesn't matter. It doesn't do. So a bunch of diplomats are going to stay home and not get to go on a taxpayer-funded vacation for 3 weeks to Beijing to the Winter Olympics. How is that a bad thing? At any rate, this producer, a guy by the name of Kyle Griffin, who's 35 years old, informed us that these abuses are alleged, and this created the firestorm on Twitter, which reacted to the word alleged quite sharply for a little while. In 1932, the Pulitzer Prize Committee awarded the Pulitzer Prize for Correspondence to a New York Times bureau chief by the name of Walter Duranty. Now, Walter Duranty is an interesting character. He's an Englishman. He was born in England. He ended up working for the New York Times as a bureau chief in Moscow, as he was in Russia basically from the beginning of the Soviet Union until he left there in 1933, 32-ish. He ended up having an accident while he was there. He lost a leg, and then he went back, and he was the New York Times bureau chief for Soviet Russia. If you go back into the newspapers of the day, and believe me, I have, you will find that he is consistently referred to as unbiased, as fair, as knowledgeable about things going on in the Soviet Union. And he may very well have been, who knows? But in 1932, he was awarded the Pulitzer Prize for Correspondence for his coverage over the previous year of events in the Soviet Union. Yay him. I mean, Pulitzer Prize, okay, great. The problem with what Walter Duranty was doing, however, became very apparent over the next year. 1933, by mid-1933, Ukraine was being systematically starved to death. And when I say Ukraine, I don't necessarily mean the country, I mean the people of Ukraine. The Ukrainians were being systematically starved to death. In one of the most hideous holocausts in the history of our human race, Stalin had decided that Ukrainians were, as you noted today, not all that excited about being part of Russia. And so they were resistive and problematic and argumentative, and so Stalin decided to teach them a lesson. And he literally starved Ukraine almost to death. Millions of people died. And the whole time this was going on, Walter Duranty, who was considered to be the most unbiased and accurate reporter about the Soviet Union, was writing articles telling people that everything's fine over there. Everything is just fine. There's no famine in Ukraine. Everything's fine. And even if there was stuff like that going on, the only people who are being affected are people who are not worthy of the genius of Stalin, who aren't worthy of having a good communist government, who aren't worthy of being governed, as most Russians are ungovernable anyway. One of the things Duranty believed was that democracy was impossible in Russia. That had to be an autocratic dictatorial system. He wrote that. And he made it clear that there was nothing going on there. And even if there was, the only people being affected were people who literally deserved it. And so stop worrying about it. He was basically a mouthpiece for Stalin, what Stalin would refer to later on as useful idiots. It would become later known, or at least alleged, if I can use that word, that Mr. Duranty knew what was actually going on in Ukraine and chose to be used as a mouthpiece of the Stalinist era, the Stalinist administration. In 1944, 12 years later, in the middle of World War II, when Uncle Joe was our ally and everything was cool with communism, because it was anti-Nazism, right? Duranty actually wrote a book in which he tried to rationalize what he had written about the Soviet Union in the 1930s, particularly in 32 and 33. He tried to apologize for not being completely accurate, but it didn't come out as an apology. In this book, it came out as I told you, these people deserve to die. They deserve to get what they wanted to be, to happen to them. And Stalin was right for doing it, and he should do more of it. The general presumption, like I said, was that Duranty, now the general presumption is that Duranty was a useful idiot. At the time, he was still believed by most people to be completely accurate and completely unbiased. British intelligence would later confirm that Duranty knew everything about what was going on in Ukraine, and that he allowed himself to be used as a mouthpiece for the Soviet government. They also hinted that he might have actually been under duress. In other words, he might have been forced to write what he wrote, praising the Soviet government for its actions in Ukraine and how everything in Ukraine was just fine. And of course, that duress came in the form of a honeypot, which is a pretty well-known Soviet tactic to use sex to entrap people to get them to do what they want them to do. In 1990, the New York Times, in response to a book that had been written that basically eviscerated Duranty's career and called him a liar, a communist mouthpiece, all these kinds of things, the New York Times assigned its own reporter to look into this because, well, New York Times, it's really our Pulitzer, even though Duranty's the one that got it. He was working for us when he got it, so let's look into this. The reporter said later that the articles in question, the articles that had been submitted for the 1932 Pulitzer Prize, were, quote, some of the worst reporting to ever appear in this paper, unquote. That's the New York Times reporter saying that about the New York Times Pulitzer-winning bureau chief in 1932. He went on to say that Duranty had, quote, bet his career on Stalin's rise, unquote, and then had allowed himself to be used to maintain that career. He allowed himself to be compromised by Stalin in order to do that. In 2003, the New York Times, in a somewhat surprising move, I guess, asked the Pulitzer Committee to revoke the prize. Quote, for the honor of the New York Times, this Pulitzer Prize needs to be revoked symbolically and posthumously, Walter Duranty's dead. We need to get rid of this because clearly this guy was just a mouthpiece of the Soviet government. They said, for our own honor, we need this revoked. You know, when you look at the Duranty case and then you look at what's going on in the media today, it's hardly the only case. But the MSNBC senior producer's tweet is kind of symptomatic, isn't it? I have spent my whole life, my entire life, hating communism. I look around today and I think to myself, all I see in the media is praise for communism. The MSNBC reporter threw that word alleged in there. Why? Because he didn't want to offend the Chinese. Why are we worried about that? Why does the NBA not want to offend the Chinese? The media used to be in opposition to communism, but today it's hard to find any media opposed to communism. And without that opposition from the mainstream media or the legacy media or television media, whatever you want to talk about it, what ends up happening? Where do people turn to learn about true communism? What actually goes on under communism? Where do people turn to learn about these things that the Chinese are, quote unquote, according to Brian, alleging to do? I've told the story before about when I was invited to speak to the Stockton Leadership Academy. I was actually part of a panel. It wasn't just me, but this panel was a bunch of people who were writers. And at the time, I was a Modesto B columnist as well as a talk show host. And it was one of the more remarkable days of my life. There were multiple things that happened, multiple layers of things that happened. The most important one was that I met my good friend Nate Scott that day, the most positive man I know. There were other things that went on with the Stockton Record. But during one of the breaks, when we were standing around having refreshments and stuff, there was a young lady that wanted to talk to me, specifically talk to me. And she wanted me to know that as a 17-year-old senior in high school, she was completely dedicated to communism, that I was wrong about everything and that communism was going to win and communism. A 17-year-old girl. Now, again, at the time, I was in my early 40s. I'm a veteran. I am who I am. And it was rather surprising. I could still see her. And I asked her some pointed questions. Have you read any of these other things? Have you read anything by Thomas Jefferson? Have you read anything by Ben Franklin? Have you read anything by Madison? Anything at all? Nope, don't need to. Why? Because communism tells me that that's all propaganda. And if I read it, I might learn propaganda. And I said to her, wait, how do you know that's not true about Das Kapital? Well, it can't be propaganda because it's right. Circular logic. And I still wonder to this day, what influenced that girl? What ever did she be? Who did she ever meet in her lifetime that told her that communism is deadly, murderous? It's totalitarianism on the level of just outright destruction. That communism is responsible for far more deaths than Nazism ever was. Not excusing Nazism, it's not what I'm saying, but the Ukraine famine, Holodomor, in the 1930s was horrifying. But her attitude was almost like Walter Duranty's. They probably deserved it. And I wonder to this day, did my 5 minutes of talking to her have any effect? I mean, does she ever talk to her friends about that crazy radio guy she met that said, maybe you ought to reconsider those things? And she did. I like to think that she did, but kind of doubt it. Why do I doubt it? Because even in the case of this MSNBC guy, Kyle Griffin, who tweeted about the alleged, the hashtag alleged human rights abuses of communist China. Okay, people fired back. What do you mean alleged? What do you mean? What do you mean? Here's a picture of a tank running over a guy in Tiananmen Square. Did anybody really notice? Did anybody really care what this guy said? Here we are, a week and a half later. Does anybody even know about it? Where is it now? run a search on Twitter like I did yesterday for hashtag alleged, which was supposed to be the trending hashtag because of his tweet, you're going to find a lot of stuff, and almost none of it, virtually, absolutely none of it, unless you're willing to go back a week, has anything to do with this MSNBC producer's tweet. Nobody cares. Virtually nobody even noticed that this producer has sent to this media guy, this reporter, it's on his CV, essentially excused communist China's behavior. There's nothing going on here. Allegedly, these are all alleged. And even if there was something going on, it's probably people who deserved it. So great. So Japan's going to join the diplomatic boycott. Anybody care? Anybody even notice? 100 years on, we're almost 100 years on from Duranty's Pulitzer Prize. Will anybody care about this tweet? Will anybody go back and say, what kind of nut jobs, what kind of idiots were willing to excuse communist China for their actions? At the time, in 1932, 1933, virtually no one cared that Duranty was outright lying. No one cared. There were people who knew that he was lying. There were people who reported that he was lying. They, in turn, were attacked. They were ostracized. They lost their jobs. Did you see what happened to Ken Rosenthal yesterday? You know, Ken Rosenthal is a reporter for Major League Baseball on Fox Sports and Major League Baseball Network. They fired him yesterday. Why? Because he criticized the commissioner's handling of some things. The people who dared to criticize Duranty were fired. They were ostracized. They were criticized. They were complained about. And in 2003, the Pulitzer Prize Committee was asked to revoke his Pulitzer Prize. They were asked, look, for the honor of the New York Times, because this is clearly bad. I mean, this guy was lying through his teeth. He was supporting a communist government. He was supporting a tyrannical dictatorship that was murdering millions of people. And he covered it like it was the greatest thing in the world. Please remove this Pulitzer Prize so we don't have to have it on our wall saying, look, we're the 1932 Pulitzer Prize winners. And the Pulitzer Prize Committee looked at this, much as most of the world has looked at Kyle Griffin's tweet over the last week, and said, we can't find where he knew that he was intentionally lying. He was just reporting. It's no harm, no foul. It's 100 years ago. Who cares? You want to know how we get to the point where Kyle Griffin tweets about alleged abuses? Well, it starts with a guy by the name of Kyle Duranty, who lied about the Holodomor, the murder of millions of people in Ukraine. How many millions of people are going to be murdered in China under these alleged human rights violations?